nothing will ever stop me from doing story time. Hello, hello. Hey, let's pick up where we left off. So, if you're in Miss Leonard's classes, welcome to my version of story time. It's a little bit different from the way that Miss Leonard does it, and that's okay. Variety is the spice of life. Sometimes she stresses things that I don't, and vice versa. So when we reconvene, you might mention some details about these stories, and she might be like, well, that's not exactly how I would tell the story, but that's okay. That's what story time is about. It's Roman history as told by the ancients, as then interpreted by Miss Leonard and yours truly. So we're going to pick up with the Romans. They fought a 10-year-long war with a town called Veii, which was like a regional rival. It's kind of like Rome and Veii are only about 9 miles apart, so sort of imagine, I don't know, like Decatur versus Atlanta, or maybe like Stone Mountain versus Atlanta, something like that. And you might remember that the Romans, at the end of the 10-year war, appointed this guy as dictator, Marcus Furius Camillus. And Camillus came up with this idea of essentially, the way the Romans would tell it, he dug a tunnel underneath Veii and up. But really, he used the extensive sewer system that the Veians had built, and they sort of crawled through the sewer system and then all the way up through into the city itself. And if you'll recall, right as he was about to push open the manhole cover and take the city by storm with his platoon of Romans, he made a prayer, a vow to the god Apollo. He said, Apollo, if we take this city of Veii from the Etruscans and it becomes ours, then I promise you 10% of everything we take, we're going to give to you for your glory. So, boom, Romans take it. Everything's good. And some of you might remember there was that side story where he ordered the treacherous teacher to be beaten up by the students. Pretty good story. But anyway, moving on. When Camillus comes back with the Roman army to Rome, there's a massive triumph. And this triumph caused a lot of debate because carrying the chariot were 4 white horses. Gasp. Because you're never, ever, ever supposed to use white horses. White horses are only for Jupiter people and not for mere mortals. So people were thinking already, has this guy Camillus let things go to his head? Well, Camillus resigns the dictatorship, becomes a private citizen. But the thing is, when he tells the rest of the Roman army about the vow that he made to Apollo to give 10% of everything that they took to Apollo, and that now that they had to make good on that vow, the rest of the Roman army was furious with him. Most of the Roman army consisted of men who didn't really have very much money at all, and so for them to go and spend 10 years besieging and fighting against a huge rival, and then taking everything and then have to be told, oh my gosh, I have to give a good chunk of this away, that didn't sit well. Now they did it because they felt like they had to, because you don't want to go against the gods, but they appealed to the tribunes of the plebs, and the tribunes of the plebs kind of accused Camillus of actually not appropriately tithing himself. In other words, he didn't give 10% of his own stuff that he took to Apollo, at least that's what the tribunes claimed. And they were about to call him up on trial when Camillus decided to go into voluntary exile. So here we have, once again, this is going to happen quite a bit, a person is basically going to save the day for Rome, and then they're either going to go into exile voluntarily or they'll be forced to go. Anyway, so Camillus is out of the picture for right now, but then almost immediately there's a huge crisis in Rome, and it's because of the Gauls. Dun, dun, dun. There's a particular tribe of Gauls called the Senones, and that's spelled Senones, which is a palindrome, by the way. And their leader was none other than this guy right here. Look at him in all of his glory. His name was Brennus, Brennus. Now, this Gallic tribe, obviously they're in what's modern-day France and also modern-day northern Italy. They decided to travel south, and as they traveled south, they started just ransacking towns, stealing a whole bunch of stuff, taking a bunch of money, and they would just go to the next town. There didn't seem to be much strategy involved except just pure greed. So They get to where the Etruscans live, Etruria, which was sort of just north of Rome, and they start besieging this one particular town. That town appeals to Rome because Rome is sort of the regional powerhouse now that Veii has been defeated. And Rome sends 3 ambassadors to try and settle this dispute. They get to the Etruscan town, they sit down with some of Brennus's top generals, and they try and talk it out. Well, it doesn't go well. Normally when you have ambassadors, you usually don't have violence break out in the meeting room, but that's exactly what happened. And one of the Roman ambassadors actually kills a Gallic chief right there in the room where they're supposed to be negotiating a peace settlement. Well, as soon as he does that, as soon as the Roman ambassador does this, the other ambassadors are like, yeah, we have to go, like, right now, because we are in big trouble. And they hightail it out of there and head back to Rome. Brennus finds out immediately that his Gallic chief, his right-hand man, has been killed by these Roman ambassadors, so he takes his army and starts marching south, following the ambassadors to Rome. The ambassadors get to Rome. They say, yeah, we kind of made a huge mistake, and now we're all about to die unless we get a ragtag army together and try and head north and stop this guy Brennus and his Senones from coming into Rome itself. And so the Romans gather an army. It's very poorly trained. They haven't fought in a few years. They get together and they go north just outside the city. They go to, it's called a river. It's really more like a creek. It's about 11 miles or so north of Rome, called the Allia, Allia. And at the Battle of the Allia River, the Gauls who are marching south, the Romans who are marching north meet, and the Roman army is pretty much destroyed. There are a few survivors who manage to make it out. They start heading south as fast as they can, and of course, Brennus and his men are right on their tails. The Romans get back, the few Roman soldiers who survived, they get back into the city, and they announce far and wide what happened. We were destroyed. Brennus and his men are coming. They're going to destroy Rome. What do we do? And so, as you can imagine, mass pandemonium takes place. A lot of people try and flee the city. As you can see in this picture, I don't know if you can tell, and maybe again in this picture as well, but the Vestal Virgins they took the sacred flame, they just lit a torch essentially from the Temple of Vesta, and they were walking through the streets wondering, what are we going to do? This torch is our symbol of strength for the whole city of Rome. And a man by the name of Albinus, Albinius, was traveling out of the city. He was about to travel right out of the city, and he had a cart. And in his cart, he had as many possessions as he and his wife and kids could throw in. And of course, his wife and kids were in the cart as well. And this will just show you old school Roman values as he and his wife and kids are passing by these Vestal Virgins who are just holding a torch and kind of wondering, what are we going to do? Are we going to be safe? Albinus stops his chariot. He orders his wife and kids to get out of the chariot. He orders the Vestal Virgins to get into the chariot. He leaves his wife and kids on the side of the road, and he immediately hightails it out of there and goes south of the city of Rome and deposits the Vestal Virgins at a town where they hang out with the flame until all of this is over. We have no idea, of course, what happened to Albinus' wife and kids, but he's hailed as a hero for protecting the Vestal Virgins. So, now, at this point, all the able-bodied people in the city of Rome go to the highest point in the city, which is the Capitoline Hill. And there's a grand staircase that leads up to the Capitoline Hill. And as the last able-bodied Romans are fleeing up the top of the hill with all of their stuff, as much food as they can carry, they destroy the stairs behind them so that nobody can get up to the Capitoline Hill. Now, those who were not so able-bodied included most of the senators. Senes, of course, old men. Now, most of the senators actually gathered in the house of one particular senator named Marcus Papirius, that's Papirius, and they decided just to sit in his house and await their fate. Well, Brennus and his men come into Rome, and they're shocked that none of the Romans are at the gates trying to fight them off. And they walk through the town, and it's a ghost town, and it's really eerie. They don't know what to make of it. And finally they start going house to house inside to see if anybody's there, and they don't see anybody. And then they end up at the house of Marcus Papirius. They walk in, and what do they see? They see a ton of old, stoic-looking men sitting in chairs, not moving, not even blinking. And Brennus and his men are really confused. Are these really men that they're looking at, or are they statues? And so they walk over to these statuesque-looking men, and they wave their hands in front of the men's eyes, and the men don't blink. Well, finally, as you can see here, one Gallic soldier just can't help himself, and he starts to tug on the beard of none other than Marcus Papirius himself. And what does Marcus Papirius do, even though he's old and feeble? He takes a staff and bam, whacks it on the head of the Gallic soldier. Well, of course, at that point, all the Gallic soldiers just take out their swords and they massacre Marcus Papirius and all of the other senators who were with him. Now, as Brennus and his men are wandering through the streets of Rome, they finally, of course, discover that, whoa, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of people at the very top of the city at that big hill, but there's no way to get up. So what do? Oh, okay, well, we'll just surround the hill and try and starve them out. Which, of course, they're mostly successful in doing, but the Romans, though, they're like, no. We're going to wait these people out as long as possible. We brought a lot of food up here. So this stalemate goes on for quite a while. Now, at this point, the Romans are starting to run out of food. It's been a few weeks. And up at the very top of the hill, you have hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of Romans who are in cramped quarters, and you're running out of food. And right at the edge of the Capitoline Hill, right next to one of the temples, in a large cage, you have lots of geese. Now, there might have been a temptation to eat those geese, but you cannot eat those geese, for they are the sacred cackling geese of Juno. Now, late one night, Brennus and his men are just simply tired of waiting for the Romans to come out. And so, please don't apply logic to story time, they decide to build a human ladder and try and scale the wall. And they would have succeeded had it not been for the fact that when the last man was about to reach the wall, he accidentally made too much of a grunting noise, and it woke up the sacred cackling geese of Juno, who went nuts. And the man who was on duty for the Romans, who was standing just on the other side of the geese cage, his name was Marcus Manlius. He was manly. And he, of course, hears the cackling geese, runs over, and what does he do? He sees that the Gauls have built this human bridge, and he just basically pushes them, and they all, like dominoes, come tumbling down. And so Marcus Manlius is hailed for saving the Capitoline Hill, and he's actually given a nickname. His cognomen becomes Capitolinus, so Marcus Manlius Capitolinus. Well, it's a nice story, but of course it's not going to save the Romans themselves. Eventually, they run out of food, and they have no choice but to negotiate with Brennus. And so what does Brennus want? Well, he wants money, and that's all. He demands a certain amount of gold be paid for him. The Romans at the top of the hill figure out, yes, we can do it. We have that money. We can pool together and make that happen. And so they do. They slowly start to come down. Please don't ask me how they came down. Logic. Probably ropes. I don't know. But the staircase was destroyed, so what are you going to do? And some scales are set up here in the middle of the city, where the appropriate amount of gold is weighed out that Brennus wants. Now, at this point, a dispute breaks out between the Romans and Brennus about the scales. Brennus used some trick scales, so really he's actually getting more money than he should, and the Romans call him out on that. And what does he do? He just takes out his sword, and he hurls the sword onto the scales, weighing it down even more, and says, "Why, Victis?" which means, woe to the conquered. Basically, cry me a freaking river. I won, you lost, pay up, big boy. Now, I have to say, what happened is probably that the Romans simply paid Brennus took his money, he took his men, and they left. The Romans later on kind of invented this story, which we'll just pretend like happened. And here it is. While all of this has been going on, this weeks of starvation and whatnot, who should hear about all of this but the man in voluntary exile, Marcus Furius Camillus? And right as this scene is happening, as soon as Brennus throws his sword and says, "Why, Victis, woe to the conquered," who should appear but Camillus, who's raised an army from somewhere. I have no idea, don't ask me. They come running into the city on horseback, and they chase Brennus and his men out of the city of Rome, and they track them down to a nearby river where there's a huge battle, and who should win but, of course, the Romans. And so Camillus saves the day and is able to recover all of the gold and bring it back where it is supposedly redistributed to the Romans who gave the gold in the first place. Now, of course, the big thing is that Rome essentially has been destroyed. Brennus and his men, after they killed Marcus Papirius and all the senators, and they realized that all the other Romans were at the top of the hill, the Capitoline Hill, they set fire to everything else that was Rome. So completely wiped out, except for the Capitoline Hill. And there were many, many Romans who at this point said, why are we going to continue with this city? Why? We just conquered Veii in a war. We didn't take them over, but they're basically, they have to do what we say. Why don't we just all migrate to Veii instead? It's already a city that's pretty well built. We did some damage to it, but it's still standing, unlike ours. And Camillus gives this rousing speech where he basically says, no, you fools, this is ridiculous. We're Romans. We are destined for great things. Have you forgotten about Aeneas and his son Ascanius Iulus? Have you forgotten about Romulus and Remus? Come on, this is ridiculous. We're going to stay here. And he convinces the Romans to rebuild, the really hard task of rebuilding. And so Rome is slowly rebuilt, and it takes quite a long time for it to get back to where it was before. Now, right after the Romans start rebuilding, just a couple of years after the Battle of the Allia River, which, by the way, was July 18th, 387 BCE. And that date, July 18th, from that point forward, the Romans sort of marked that on the calendar every year as a day to remember the fact that they were beaten by the Gauls. It was like a national day of mourning. Anyway, a year or so later, Capitolinus is going to come back up. Remember, he's the guy who saved Rome with the cackling geese and whatnot. Well, he got extremely jealous of Camillus and some of the others. He felt like they didn't give him enough credit for saving Rome during the Gallic invasion. Now, even though he was a patrician, he started to ally himself with the plebeians, and he made the argument that the gold that was raised to pay off Brennus came from the pockets of everybody, but then it was returned by Camillus only to a few, and so he basically claimed that the senators stole it. So a crisis is brewing. A dictator is appointed, this time not Camillus, and Capitolinus is arrested and thrown in prison for making these charges. When you make charges like this in public, and you don't necessarily have evidence for it, the Romans consider that borderline treason. Well, the common people, the plebeians got very, very, very upset, and they started publicly mourning the fact that Capitolinus was in prison. And so what they did was they let their hair grow out, and they let their beards grow out, and they wore black clothes, black togas, and every day they gathered in front of the jail, and they just sat there all day long. And the senators were really afraid that these guys were eventually going to riot, so they set Capitolinus free pending his trial. Well, once he was set free, Capitolinus started having strategic meetings with some of the plebeian leaders at his house at night. But one thing, people, that you never do in ancient Rome is you never, ever, ever have meetings in your house at night, because it means bad things are being plotted. And so the senators start a whispering campaign aimed at making the people turn on Capitolinus. And of course they're saying, look, he's having meetings in his house at night. He's getting an arsenal together. He wants to be king. He wants to kill us all. But the day of the trial approaches, and Capitolinus is ready, he produces 400 men that he had lent money to free of interest to kind of vouch for his character. He produces as evidence the spoils of the Gallic men that he had killed as evidence of his bravery and his patriotism. He produces several of his fellow soldiers whom his actions had saved. And in the conclusion of his dramatic speech that he gives on behalf of himself, he rips apart his own toga and tunic and shows his own battle scars that he had received fighting the Gauls on his chest. And in a dramatic gesture, he points up to the Capitoline Hill and says, "Look up there and see what I have saved." And the people in the crowd are like, "Yeah, this guy's awesome. We love him." Now, a very fast-thinking praetor, a judge, immediately adjourns the trial for the next day. And when they reconvene the next day, the judge purposely picked an area of the city that from where they were, you couldn't see the Capitoline Hill. So, the trial starts again, and the judge says to Capitolinus, "Okay, you were giving us a dramatic speech, pick up exactly where you were." And of course, Capitolinus, being like a teacher, kind of backs up a few and says, "Look, look, look up there and see what I have saved." And as he's pointing, he kind of looks and he's like, "Oh crap, I can't see the hill. Where is it? I don't know." And then, of course, all the people in the audience who had just seen the hill the day before and were on his side, they're looking around, they're like, "You see what he's pointing at?" "No, I don't see what he's pointing at." "Oh, this guy's crazy." And so, of course, boom, what do? The people turn on him. The judges got what they want, the senators got what they want, and he's declared a traitor to Rome. And what happens to traitors? Of course, they're hurled from the Tarpeian Rock. There he is, by the way, pointing dramatically, and people are like, "What? What hill? What are you talking about?" And here he is, hurled from the Tarpeian Rock. Why he's naked, I have no idea, and why he has a sword and spear, just don't ask. But anyway, so it's a bit of irony here, right? The Capitoline Hill is where the Tarpeian Rock is, so it's both the scene of his greatest achievement and of his death. Now, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus actually lived on the Capitoline Hill. His house was then torn down. A law was passed that nobody could live on the Capitoline Hill anymore. And then finally, a law was passed that made it illegal for anybody in the Manlius family ever to have the first name, the praenomen of Marcus again. Oh my goodness. Crazy times. Next time on Storytime, a plague in Rome.